Welcome everybody. It's National um, Ethics and Accountability Month at AFP, and you are here today talking with my good friend and colleague Meredith. And we're going to talk today about ethics. We're going to talk about navigating integrity in the nonprofit development world. So let me introduce the Fundraising Academy in slide 2. So you've got a cause, and it's really important that we are involved. You've got a cause, and our goal at the Fundraising Academy is to help you learn how to fund it. It's all about funding all those beautiful causes that you guys work for. Who am I? I am Jack Alato, as I said, and I am right now in beautiful downtown St. Louis, Missouri at the AFP Lead Conference. And with this beautiful background, it's a little bit chilly for me. It's like 37 degrees. I'm from California, so it's much colder than I'm used to. And I am a trainer, as I said. I am a guy who runs CFRE study groups, and I love my work at National Academy's Fundraising Academy. Today, though, you are going to hear from my good friend and colleague, Meredith, who is an instructor at National University's Fundraising Academy, where she teaches courses on fundraising fundamentals and cause selling. She's also a co-host of the Nonprofit Show podcast, which boasts a viewership of over 20,000. I've been on that podcast. I know it's a great one. I love it. She has worked exclusively in the nonprofit industry for 15 years as a frontline fundraiser and consultant, guiding strategic planning, capital campaigns, and leadership development. Her areas of expertise, and she has a lot more than I'm going to list right now, lies in strategic planning, major gifts, and diversifying development portfolios for sustainable growth. She founded a consulting firm in 2018 called the Allied Group and has worked as a capital campaign consultant and advisor for a number of national nonprofit organizations. Meredith also serves as the executive vice president of chapter impact at Blue Star Families. I love the organization, by the way, Meredith. In this capacity, she oversees the entire chapter network, including 13 chapters and 24 outposts across the continental United States. Meredith serves as the lead strategist, facilitating and overseeing community partnerships across the chapter networks and diversifying development portfolios for chapter growth, expansion, and sustainability. And if that's not enough, that's enough for any person. I'll tell you that right now. Meredith has 3 children and lives in Tampa, Florida, where I hope she's okay from the hurricane. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend and colleague, Meredith. Take it away.
Wow, what an introduction. And thank you, Jack, for that. It's a pleasure to be here talking about ethics with you today. I am calling in actually from New York City today. I'm here on a trip for a fundraising event that I'm attending. I can tell you it's like a cool 54 degrees here today. I am not in Tampa, but just for anybody who's wondering, we had lots and lots of damage in Tampa, but I live about 30 miles inland, so we were relatively spared from the worst of the weather. But let's get into our real topic today of discussion, which is all about ethics. So we're going to talk today about these are really our 4 objectives. So we want to learn how to understand the basic tenets of ethics. How does it relate to fundraising? What does that mean as we talk about the nonprofit industry? We're going to review a code of conduct for fundraisers. We're going to learn how to maintain transparency with our donors. And finally, we're going to understand how to navigate conflicts of interest as fundraisers and as nonprofit professionals as we interact with our donors. So before we get into it, I want to hear a little bit from our audience here. And we have a couple of poll questions that we're going to pop up on your screen in front of you. We'd love to have your interaction and participation in this. Let us know what you think about the first one here. Does your organization have a conflict of interest policy? We'll give everybody a minute or so to answer this, and then I'll share out the results. Okay, we're getting some good responses here. And Jack, I don't know if you're seeing them on your end, but
I am.
I'm actually pleasantly surprised.
Me
Okay, so
too.
Here's what we have on our results here. Does your organization have a conflict of interest policy? Let's see here. 77% say yes, they do, which is incredible. And there was 0% said no. There's a small percentage here, 23%, that say they're really not sure if they do. I am pleasantly surprised by these results, though. So this is really, really good feedback. Okay, we got one more poll question for you here. And it'll pop up on your screen in front of you. Take a minute to answer this one. Does your organization have internal ethical policies? Give everybody a minute or so to answer this one. Okay, this one is more interesting, I think, in terms of a spread on results. So let's see here. All right, so this one is a little more evenly split. Does your organization have internal ethical policies? About 34% said yes, 31% says no, and the other 1/3 says not sure. So this is a really good kind of indicator for us about how nonprofits are operating as it relates and pertains to ethics. So this is really great. It kind of sets the stage for us as we talk about this topic today. Now, we're all fundraisers here, or in some way, shape, or form are engaging in fundraising. Before we get into our main topic of ethics, let's talk a little bit about the cause selling cycle. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this one, but I think it's really important for us to kind of set the stage with when we're talking about ethics, what does that mean in relation to fundraising? Here at National University's Fundraising Academy, we teach the cause selling cycle. It includes 8 essential steps. This may look familiar to some of you because it's very, very similar to the traditional fundraising cycle, but there's a few things that I just want to focus in on here. The cause selling cycle has 8 essential steps. We break them down into 3 distinct phases. So phase 1 is what you're seeing in the dark blue there. This is all of the work that's necessary to prospect for or find qualified potential donors. So keep that in mind as we talk about ethics today. When we're talking about prospecting or approaching donors or prospects for the first time, we are in that first phase of the fundraising of the cause selling cycle. That includes prospecting in the pre-approach. The pre-approach is preparing to make a great first impression by learning more about your prospect and setting up for your approach. The purple, phase 2, is what you're seeing in the purple there. Phase 2 refers to all of the face-to-face time with prospective donors that you spend as a fundraiser. So at this point in phase 2, you have already identified a prospect, you have qualified your prospect, you have made at least an initial approach or at least an initial first impression. Now in phase 2, you are at the face-to-face phase where you're interacting with your prospect the most. This includes everything from the approach to need discovery, which refers to asking meaningful questions to learn key information about your donor or your prospect. It includes the presentation, which is where you communicate your cause and where you demonstrate your impact to your prospect or your donor. And it includes step number 6, which is handling objections. This is all about understanding where your donor is and whether they're ready for an ask. That moves us into the light green, which is phase 3. So phase 3 is all about everything that happens after the gift is given. So in phase 3, you are at the point where you're making an ask, you've developed a relationship with your donor, you have an understanding of what their needs are, their interests are, their passions, and how those align with your organization. And it also includes our final step, which is stewardship. Of course, we all know the importance of stewardship, which is fostering loyalty through strong donor engagement and deepening your relationship with your donor. So that is the cause selling cycle. And when we talk about fundraising, these are the 8 essential steps that we're referring to today. Now, the topic of our webinar is really all about ethics. So we're going to be talking about ethics. What does ethics mean? How does it relate to fundraising? And how does it impact each of these steps in the cause selling cycle? So what is ethics? Ethics is a systematic effort to judge human behavior as right or wrong, right? So I want you all to kind of think here about what does ethics mean to you? We would love to have your comments in the chat box here. Jack is monitoring the chat. We'll be calling out a few of these, but we want to kind of understand when we refer to the word ethics in the nonprofit industry, what does that mean and how does it sort of differ from the idea of ethics in the for-profit world? So give us some of your comments there in the chat box. What does ethics mean to you? Again, how does it relate to the nonprofit industry? How does it differ from the for-profit industry? We just love to have your thoughts as we sort of set the stage here for our main topic today on ethics. Give everybody a minute or so to drop some comments in. In the meantime, Jack, I'd love to hear from you. What are your thoughts here on ethics? I know Jack does a lot of work in teaching and instructing this, and also is a trainer for hosts all of the CFRE training courses. I know that ethics is a big topic in that as well.
So before I talk, a couple of people have their hand raised. So why don't we hear their questions, and then definitely I'll weigh in on my understanding about ethics.
Okay,
Let's
great.
start
Let's
with
do it.
Courtney. Courtney, for some reason, I am not hearing Courtney.
I think, Courtney, you have to, for all of you with your hands raised, because we're in a webinar format, drop your comments into the
In
chat box and
yeah,
then we'll know to look for them based on who has their hand raised. But we're in a webinar format, not a traditional Zoom format. So go ahead and drop your comments into that chat box. Jack is monitoring for us.
yes. But while we're waiting for that, Meredith, I will tell you that in my career, certainly, which has spanned a couple decades, more than a couple decades, I've seen a lot of ethical issues that arise. And one of the questions I've always asked myself, Meredith, there are many things that are considered ethical, but are they moral? And trying to understand the difference between ethics and morality. And trust me, I still don't have an answer for that. But gosh, if somebody on this webinar has an answer for the difference between ethics and morality, I'd certainly like to see. Because I have found in my career, and I don't know about you, Meredith, where sometimes something may seem ethical. It's an ethical thing to do, but I've asked myself, is that the morally correct thing to do? So it's a complicated question. What do you think?
That's an interesting concept here. What is the difference between ethics and morals? And it's very thought-provoking. So this is a really good one that kind of sets the stage for us as we go into our next, topic here as we go on. Jack, do you see any comments in the chat box? Anything?
So our good friend Jess, who we love dearly, has sent a message saying, have them, if they prefer, I figured out how to let them raise their hand. They can speak by raising their hand. So let's
Oh,
start with
perfect.
Courtney. Let's have Courtney be the first one up there. Courtney Huffman, tell us what I think you can unmute yourself.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, we can hear you now.
Great. So the chat is disabled, which is why no one's using it. That's why we're all raising our hands. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we'll get that
So
one fixed right away.
so Courtney, you could ask your questions since we could hear you just fine. That would be fine while we're waiting for that to work.
I didn't actually have a question. I just wanted to let you know that
Oh, so
we
you're a
couldn't
fix it
message.
guy. I love
Yeah.
it. Anybody else want to ask a question out verbally? We could do that. Who are they? Two participants raised their hands. Just unmute yourself, guys. John, I know John Leach, Napa, Idaho. All right,
Yeah,
John,
hey,
go
Jack.
for it.
I wonder, is ethics just what's maybe best practice for an institution or a person in a certain role as it applies to what's best horizontally
Yeah.
in the interest of that person, in the interest of all others, in the interest of the institution, and so on. I wonder if morality is driven a little bit more by something like the way you were raised, your upbringing, maybe
Hmm.
some spiritual values that I think um, might shed light on ethics, but I
Yeah.
think runs maybe a little deeper.
Yeah. And I think, John, as I remember, you're a pastor at a church, so
That's
um,
correct.
I'm gonna defer to your understanding of the difference between ethics and morality. Thank you so much for that comment. I like that. It's good. Anyone else want to unmute themselves?
Jack, I
Okay.
really appreciate what John said here. When I think of sort of what is the difference between ethics and morals, I sort of define those. John sort of said it best when he referred to the institution, right? So I always think of ethics are sort of defined by a community. Or defined by an institution, but morals vary from person to person, and those are influenced by your personal beliefs or your personal values.
Yeah.
So this is a really interesting topic. I see a comment in the chat right now from Courtney.
Yeah.
She sort of echoes the same sentiment. She says, when I think of ethics in fundraising, I think of using gifts as they are meant to be used, reporting on numbers without manipulating them, understanding when a donor is not in a mental space to make a gift and not pushing that gift. That is a really, really good, I think, definition or description of ethics as it relates to fundraising. And these are all, everything you described here, Courtney, are examples of, at least in my career, places that I've been myself, right? These are actual real life scenarios that we've had to address as fundraisers. Okay,
Good
good. This
comment.
is really interesting. Any other
Yeah.
comments before we kind of dive into it? And just for everybody, for housekeeping note here, you're welcome to take yourselves off of mute if you just want to jump in with a question at any time, or feel free to drop it into the chat box as well. We will reserve some time at the end of our webinar today to do Q&A. So if you'd like to, you can also jot down your questions and save them for a more robust discussion at the end as well. All right, let's talk about the three sort of basic tenets of ethics, right? Here's what when we refer to ethics in fundraising, we are referring to these three basic tenets: the universal code, truthfulness, and personal accountability. So when we are referring to sort of the universal code, that's, in other words, the golden rule, right? So we've heard this one more of, there's many different ways of saying it. We've heard, for example, in certain cultures, they say it a different way, but they all sort of have the same universal code or the same message. So for example, in Christianity, when we refer to to the Bible or to Jesus as to a religious figure, we say, "Do unto others as you would have them do to you." That would be an example of the universal code, which is very much the same as what we hear in Buddhism, which is treat not others in a way you yourself would find hurtful. That's a quote from Buddha himself. Wish for others what you wish for yourself. That's what we hear from the Prophet Muhammad. So as you can see here, this universal code is something that sort of defines ethical behavior across the gamut of cultures, right? So that's the first basic tenet. The second one is truthfulness. Truthfulness refers to integrity and your word, right? So this is critical. It's really important. Your word is your bond. A strong relationship cannot be built on a bed of lies, right? So it's really important that we are truthful and we are honest as fundraisers. Courtney said it in her comment in the chat box when she referred to, she referenced having to report on numbers and metrics and data and facts. It's really critical that we are truthful as fundraisers in what we are telling or what we are saying. In Fundraising Academy, I briefed you guys in the very beginning here on the cause selling cycle. Why do we call it the cause selling cycle? Because we believe that every person, regardless of your profession or your role, all of us as human beings are selling something at some point, right? We're selling our ideas, we're selling our opinions, we're selling products or services, we're selling things to our beneficiaries in our nonprofit, mission. So all of us are selling. So this idea of truthfulness is absolutely critical, that whatever we are selling, we're being very honest and truthful about. The last basic tenet here in ethics is personal accountability. So personal accountability refers to your attitude. It refers to accepting personal responsibility for your own actions. It refers to the way that we do or do not point fingers at other people when a mistake is made. It refers to accepting personal responsibility and recognizing it as a strength, and recognizing that your personal accountability or responsibility for your actions or for your organization or for your mission also lends itself to that truthfulness. So these are the three basic tenets of ethics. This is what guides our ethical behavior. As we talked about previously in our discussion, ethics is kind of defined by community. So these are the three basic tenets that we have defined in the nonprofit industry that sort of guide our ethical behavior. Now let's talk a little bit about a code of conduct for fundraisers. The Code of Conduct for Ethical Standards is defined by AFP, which of course is the Association of Fundraising Professionals. It includes these four kind of tenets here, right? So public trust, transparency, and conflicts of interest. What the AFP Code of Ethical Standards says about this topic of public trust, transparency, and conflict of interest is that members of AFP, fundraisers that are members of the association, shall not engage in activities that conflict with their fiduciary, ethical, and legal obligations to their organization, constituents, or to the profession. It says that members should not exploit any relationship with a donor, with prospects, volunteers, or with clients. It says that members should never disparage competitors untruthfully. That one's really interesting to me because we know that there are many, many organizations oftentimes that share our same mission or share our same sort of mission space, if you will. So this one's really kind of interesting, that we should never disparage competitors untruthfully. The second piece here of the Code of Conduct for fundraisers refers to solicitation and stewardship of philanthropic funds. What AFP says about this is that members should ensure that all solicitation and communication is accurate and reflects the organization's mission. Courtney referenced that in her first comment there, is that, this lends itself to that truthfulness aspect. It says that members should ensure proper stewardship of all revenues, report in a timely way the use and management of funds. That is absolutely critical. It's also going to help us move our donors through that cause selling cycle, right? If we build trust and transparency with our donors by ensuring that we are stewarding their revenues, or stewarding our revenues very well, that we are reporting in a timely and accurate way the use of those funds, it's going to keep our donors engaged in that cause selling cycle. The AFP also says about this second bullet here on solicitation and stewardship, that members should obtain donor consent before altering the conditions of financial transactions. This one is one that I think is particularly important. I can't tell you how many times in my career as a fundraiser, I have had to go back to a donor and ask permission to repurpose funds. So this one is what I would describe as being one of the more commonplace scenarios that you're likely to meet in your career as a fundraiser. So keep that in mind. Keep that in mind that you need to obtain donor consent before you alter the conditions.
Yeah, Meredith, I love this. This thing is so important because I know that many of the people, at least in my experience in teaching classes or train as a trainer, fundraisers say to me, "What happens, Meredith, when a board member says to you, Meredith, can you let me know how much Jack gave in the annual campaign? How to deal with that situation where you have this power figure from the board asking you something that is proprietary information. How anybody could unmute or put in chat how they would deal with it. But Meredith, I'm interested in how you would deal with that.
That's a
Sorry to
great
put you on
question.
the spot. I know
No,
that
no. That's a great question, and it's one again that is, I think, one of the more common scenarios that we encounter as fundraisers, right? This refers to that treatment of confidential information. How do we use our donor databases? Who has access to them? Who has access to what's inside of them? Well, I can tell you what AFP says about this is that you cannot disclose confidential information to folks that are what we consider unauthorized parties. You have to give your donors the opportunity to have their names removed from lists that are sold or rented. And also, as fundraisers, how many times do we ask a donor how they'd like to be listed? oftentimes, I'm just curious, maybe in a show of hands or in the chat box, like how many times have you come across a donor who has requested to remain anonymous? I mean, Jack, I'm sure you've seen that yourself.
Yeah, lots of times people want to remain anonymous. They don't want their email shared. They don't want anything about what they've given. You mentioned the 8 stages of the cost selling cycle. And again, to this third point, which I think is so important, is that as we move a donor through that 8 cycle, that journey. I call it the donor's journey. They tell us so much about themselves. They tell us about their financial ability. They tell us about their interest in the program, how they're linked to the mission and vision and values of the organization. They tell us things that they typically only tell financial advisors about ability, and maybe their priest, their pastor, their rabbi, their imam about personal things about themselves. I mean, I've heard so many things that are personal. And as fundraisers, we have such a tremendous duty to keep these things confidential and not divulge them to people outside of that small network of people who have access to that customer relationship management system where these things are held.
Yeah, that is so true, Jack. And we have a comment. I see Tracy's hand up. Tracy, can you unmute yourself and maybe share with us your thoughts, your comment here?
And I see
Sometimes,
the Fundraising Academy has its hand up
yeah,
too.
I was gonna say sometimes you have to ask. I think you may have to request permission to unmute yourself, but if you can, unmute yourself and share with us any comments or thoughts you have here. I also see a comment in the chat box from Christy. Christy
Yeah,
says, in short, you have to say that you can't disclose confidential information. And I think that refers to Jack to the question you had posed earlier. What do you do when a board member asks
right.
you
Yeah,
for, information about a donor or a gift? And to Christy's point, it's perfectly appropriate, and probably ethical to
yeah.
respond and say that you can't disclose that confidential information.
Right. And I know Christy and I know how smart she is as a fundraiser, so I'll compliment her publicly. The other thing that that I've seen in my career, maybe you have too, Meredith, is when I've been to a board member where we say, any donor has the right to review the information that is in the database. It's one of the AFP standards of ethical behavior, one of their code of conduct. And I actually had a board member right at the board meeting say, well, I'm going to come down after this board meeting. I want to see what's in my data in my profile in your database. So we have to be really careful about confidentiality and proprietary information and what we put in that database. Tracy has their hand up. Um, Tracy, it looks like you're unmuted, so please tell us
Yes,
what.
can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, I had a donor that was very adamant about being anonymous and didn't want any information to go out there. So yeah, just you said raise your hand if you have anybody
Yeah.
that's ever asked to be anonymous. Absolutely.
Yeah, sure. And is Mike on the webinar today? Is he here? I see, Christy, you mentioned Mike.
I see a
Um,
comment in the chat box actually from Mike where he posed a question. He said, would that board member also be okay with his or her own donation information being shared with somebody else?
that's a great
That's
question.
an interesting way to kind of flip this
Yes.
scenario, right?
Yeah, Mike, that's a good question. And I mean, you'd have to ask them. Um, I've, in my experience, I worked in healthcare philanthropy in hospitals, and I've had the CEO of the hospital, Meredith, come and say to me, how much is Dr. So-and-so given to the annual campaign? And I'm like, well, I'm going to have to go ask Dr. So-and-so if it's okay for me to disclose to you how much he gave to the annual campaign. And you know what the CEO said to me? Oh, never mind. Never mind. Because I would have to go to that donor and say, hey, the CEO of the hospital is interested in the amount that you gave. Um, to the annual campaign. So that's an interesting thing.
Well, the last piece of this code of conduct for fundraisers refers to compensation bonuses and finder's fees. I think the real important takeaway on this one, Jack, is that we are instructed and told that it is unethical to accept compensation based as a percentage of contributions. Also unethical to accept finder's fees or contingent fees. So that's something that, as we see, I'll tell you, this topic of bonuses comes up frequently in the nonprofit industry. They are becoming more and more commonplace to have bonus structures for fundraisers. That in and of itself is not unethical, but again, if it's structured as a percentage of fees raised, that's something you absolutely want to stay away from.
Yeah. Ashish, I see you're on the call and you actually have a question, but I have a question for you. What's an SMT? I'm not familiar with that SMT. Meredith, you know what an SMT is? I always learn from Ashish. He's a great guy. Ashish, unmute yourself. Tell us what an SMT is.
Senior
Senior
management team.
management team. Ah, there you go. See, I'm out of it. I'm out of the loop with these new you know, initials. Yeah, I think it depends. Not everybody on the senior management team should have access to the database. I think the director of development, probably the database manager, and a few other people in the development department, but does the CEO have to have access? I don't know. What do you think, Meredith?
I think generally, as a rule of housekeeping, the less cooks in the kitchen, the better. So I always recommend that you want to keep your your database restricted to only those folks that need to be in there.
Yeah,
Um, just again, I don't even know that that's an ethical dilemma. I think it just makes for better housekeeping. It's better best
yeah,
practices on how you
right.
manage your data. But yes, oftentimes I think generally folks within the organization typically are considered, have a right to know or a need to know basis, again, if they're within the organization. But oftentimes what you don't want to do is share access to your database with outside consultants. So again, if your senior management team may or may not have access to the database, I can tell you in my role that I work with at Blue Star Families, I have access to the database. I can get in there, but I don't get in frequently to enter or manage
Yeah,
data in there. So I'm not sure that would pose an ethical dilemma, but still, they're all thought-provoking questions.
sure.
Um,
And Christy has said, excellent comparison, Meredith. I don't know if you saw that in chat. Thanks, Christy. Thanks for that compliment. We appreciate that.
one last question on this slide before we go on. I just want to be mindful of time.
So
Ashish says,
yeah,
so
go
for my
ahead.
clarification, we must ensure confidentiality for the people beyond the database access. Yes, I think in a nutshell is a really great way to sum this discussion up. Generally, the folks that are within your organization are, I don't think there's a huge ethical dilemma there with them having access to your donors or to your database. There are oftentimes verbal conversations that take place about donors across teams, right? So sometimes the folks in your communications or PR team are made aware of donors, how much they gave, what they gave for. So again, they're internal to your organization, but certainly you want to be really, really cautious of that before you share any of that information externally, again, beyond, your internal team. Okay, so why does all of this matter? This is just a report here from give.org. This is the donor trust report. It's just an interesting statistic that I'd like to share is 81% of donors say that they would stop supporting an organization if they felt that it wasn't transparent about its work. That's a pretty big statistic, 81%. So that, again, I think just sort of emphasizes or highlights here why it's so important that we pay attention to ethics, that why we have ethical policies in place for our organizations, and why transparency is so important and relevant. Okay, let's talk a little bit about protecting confidentiality of our donors while also being transparent at the same time. It almost sounds like a little bit of a dilemma here. So how do we protect confidentiality but also be as transparent as possible? So transparency helps us to build credibility and trust, which are essential for long-term donor relationships. This is the whole topic of transparency, right? So how do we build donor trust? There are really 6 strategies for doing so. The first one refers to that topic of transparency and honesty. That means being open about how our donations are being used and the impact that they have. It refers to sharing financial reports, providing updates, and communicating successes and challenges honestly with your donors. Your donors, in a nutshell, want to feel confident that their contributions are being used effectively and ethically. So for that reason, you must be transparent and honest about what you're doing with their dollars. Number 2, personalizing communications. So this is important. This topic here is important for more than just building donor trust. It's actually a really good best practice that will help you kind of move folks through that cause selling cycle. But personalized communications refers to tailoring communication to each donor. What that does is it makes your donors feel that you value them as individuals, not just as sources of funding, right? So how do we personalize our communication? Think of things like using their preferred names, acknowledging specific contributions that they've made, sharing updates that are specific and relevant to their individual interests. Number 3, timely and genuine gratitude. So what do we mean by that? That refers to thanking donors promptly after they give, making the expression of gratitude very sincere. Personalized thank you notes, calls, videos, those types of things go a long way in making your donors feel appreciated and valued. Number 4, consistency in engagement. This refers to staying in touch with your donors beyond just asking for contributions, right? So that your donors don't only want to hear from you when you need money. So it's really important to be consistent in your engagement. It means providing them with newsletters, impact reports, invitations to events that are not necessarily fundraising events, giving them opportunities to engage with your leadership or your board. That's what we refer to when we're talking about consistency and engagement. Demonstrating accountability. This is how number 5 on how to build donor trust. This refers to being accountable for the results of your programs and your fundraising efforts. So many of our donors view their donations as an investment. It's our job as fundraisers to show them a return on that investment. So we have to show donors how their gifts have made a difference, share things like testimonials, data, success stories, things of that nature. The last one here, engaging donors in the mission. So how do we do that effectively? We have to give them a sense of ownership by involving them in your mission. Invite them to volunteer. Invite them to attend your events or to participate in strategy discussions. There's an old adage in fundraising that says that when we ask for money, we get advice, but when we ask for advice, we get money. So again, engage your donors, ask them to participate in strategy discussions, give them a seat at the table. These are really great ways for you to build trust with your donors and also to be transparent while doing so. I'm going to pause there if there's any kind of questions or comments. We covered a lot on this slide.
Yeah. One of the things that I always ask people is how do you show transparency? How could a nonprofit show transparency? And I'd be interested in hearing from you as well as the group. How does an organization show its donors, its constituencies transparency? Anyone?
Jack, this is a good question. And one of the things I always think of on this topic is there are so many like seals of distinction that we kind of go after as nonprofits. So
Yeah.
there are kind of nonprofit watchdogs out there like Candid or
Yeah.
GuideStar, where
Yeah.
we are looking for that platinum seal of transparency, something like that, which
Yeah.
sort of indicates or stamps that your organization is, meeting best practices.
Yeah, and in chat they're putting some great things in there, which I love. They also mention Candid and GuideStar. Christy does. Mike mentions the annual report, the 990 on your website. Thoughtful stewardship plans, Ashley put in there. And impact reporting, audited financial statements. if available on your website. I love all of these because for me, transparency is the foundation of trust, and donors have to trust us. And when you put these things on the website, like Pat has or Ashley's mentioned, audited financial statements, etc., you are showing your donors and your prospective donors that you are transparent, and that builds trust. Great answers, guys.
Okay, this is really good. Okay, let's talk about this next one here, which refers to key areas for transparency. So as we're talking about transparency, what do we mean? We mean being transparent about how your funds are being used. So your donors want to know that their contributions are making a real impact, right? So clearly communicate how donations are allocated, whether they're going to specific programs, operating expenses, etc. Example, let me give you an example of what this looks like. 85% of all donations go directly to program services, while 10% supports administrative costs and 5% supports future growth. That would be transparency so that folks know that of every dollar that they give, 85 cents is going to directly to programs and services, 10 cents goes to administrative, etc. The next one, your donors need to have transparency on the impact of their donations. And what the key here is real results. So what do we mean by that? Sharing stories and data about the tangible impact of donations is absolutely critical. Provide updates on how donations have furthered your mission. Include statistics, case studies, testimonials from beneficiaries. These are real results that are tangible. It shows the impact of their donation. What does that look like to a donor? Example, thanks to your support, 1,200 children received school supplies this year, improving access to education in underserved areas. That is a very tangible sort of statistic or data point here that you can share with your donors, that the dollars that they contributed throughout the year funded school supplies for 1,200 students. That's a real tangible kind of metric. What else do we need to be transparent about? We need to be transparent about clear and honest communication about financial health of our organization and our needs. So what do we mean by that? It means being upfront about your organization's financial status, whether it's good or bad. So that helps to build trust with your donors. Share financial statements or summaries in a way that's accessible to your donors, that highlights your sustainability as an organization and your needs. If there are specific fundraising goals that you have, you want to be transparent about why these funds are necessary and how they'll be used to ensure your organization's success. Example, what does that look like to a donor? It looks like this. We need to raise $100,000 this quarter to sustain our emergency food relief program, ensuring that no family goes hungry during the winter months. That's what that looks like to a donor. Any thoughts on this one here? Jack, anything you would add to this
Well,
list?
I love the last point. I think it's really important because I always like to say that donors give to your future, to what you're going to achieve in the future, not to your past. So it's really important to talk about your future needs. They want to get to the future. The other thing that I think is really important is that donors want to hear about your success, but they really, 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 really want to hear about your challenges. Because when you tell them about your challenges, like you mentioned earlier, Meredith, the things that you've not completed, that you've not achieved, that's where they're going to want to put their money. They're going to want to put the money to help you because they believe in your mission, your vision, and your values. They're going to want to put some money into a program that needs to be funded.
Yeah, that's a great point. And it's also an opportunity for you to really be vulnerable with your donors. Share with them what are your needs and your challenges. Like I love this sort of last example here, which says we need to raise $100,000 this quarter to sustain our emergency food relief program. It lets your donors know that there's a sense of urgency, and it sort of implies what the consequence will be if you don't raise those dollars. You won't be able to provide emergency food relief. All good thoughts, good comments here. Okay, let's talk about this next one here, which is protecting confidentiality while being transparent. So we want to be sensitive to there is sensitive information that we want to protect for our donors. So donor financial data, that refers to things like their payment details. If somebody makes a donation with a credit card, it's really critical that we have systems in place. This also opens up a whole can of worms, a whole new topic on cybersecurity, right? One that we don't have time to go into today, but this refers to donor financial data. So payment details, your donor's donation history, how many times have they given, and what are the values and amounts of those gifts? How long have they been engaged with your organization, etc. That's sensitive information you want to protect. The personal information of your donors, that refers to their contact information, their addresses, where they live, where they spend their time. I know I have several donors that I work with that sort of split their time between 2 states or 2 homes. That's information that they are entrusting to you as an organization or as a fundraiser. They certainly don't want everyone knowing when they're not at their home in New York because they're gone in Florida for the winter. That's sensitive information that we have an obligation to protect. Confidential board discussions or strategy. This one's really interesting as well. Oftentimes, boards of directors or trustees will go into what's called an executive session. That's a confidential discussion, right? So some of us as fundraisers not only work internally for organizations, but sometimes we serve on boards as well. And so this kind of poses an interesting point. I think in a nutshell, the point I really want to emphasize about protecting confidentiality while also maintaining transparency is that it's a balancing act. We have to be transparent about organizational needs and how the donations are being used, but we must protect donor privacy and sensitive internal information. So use anonymized data when you're discussing donor impact stories without disclosing private details. So we want to share just enough so that we can show that we're being transparent, but not enough that we are violating anybody's confidentiality. Some best practices to adhere to is clear privacy policies and data protection measures. Again, that kind of refers to that topic on cybersecurity. I will tell you that's more and more relevant today as we do everything digitally. Many organizations that I've worked with have cybersecurity policies in place. They do cyber health checks on their organization on an annual basis. That's a best practice you would want to engage in. Also, regular donor communication that balances that transparency piece with also discretion. Now, let's open up the floor for community share. Okay, I know we've got some comments in the chat box we can get to. Also, we want to hear your thoughts and opinions on this one. How does your organization or the one that you work with show transparency? Now that we've kind of defined transparency, give us some examples, some real life examples. How do you show it at your organization? Feel free to either take yourself off of mute or drop your comments in the chat box. Somebody had said earlier in one of the chats that I had reviewed or read, somebody referenced things like impact reports. That's a really good one. That's a best practice that I would highly recommend for organizations, is to create like an annual report or an impact report for either, again, on an annual basis for your whole organization, or you could do an impact report for one specific program. That allows, it's a really good way. One of the things we talked about previously was that it has to be easily accessible to your donors. If your donors know that you publish an annual report, they know when to look for it, they know where to find it. That's something that, it can be housed on your website, so it's publicly available. What other ways do you show transparency?
Does anyone ever publish their strategic plan on their website?
Yes, that's a great example, Jack, actually.
Yeah.
I did a strategic plan with an organization as a consultant, and they not only did they display it on their website, they actually created an entire website for the strategic plan. So it was like what do they call those? Like a one-page web, you scroll down and had all the different tabs, but you could really like dive into it. So that's a great example.
Yeah. And you know what I'm seeing, Meredith, as we move forward, I'm seeing more things about that people are sharing, like a beneficiary bill of rights, which
Yes.
is something that, talking about here's how we guard our beneficiaries, the clients of our services. Here's their Bill of Rights. Where I see things, I mean, I have an article coming out with my good friend and colleague Angela Barnes in Advancing Philanthropy about the downside of donor-centric fundraising and having a fundraiser bill of rights, which is something that we should be seeing. And all of these things should be published, I think, on the website, or at least made available to the public in some transparent way. I think there are other things that we could absolutely do. We could put on our donor acceptance policies and
Yeah.
gifts that we would not accept. I worked in healthcare my entire career, and in various hospitals, there was not a single hospital that would accept tobacco money as a gift. And many of those hospitals would publish that on their website, much to my dismay sometimes, because I always thought I could get big bucks from a tobacco company. Some of the other hospitals that were faith-based, Meredith, they would not accept money from alcohol
Yeah.
companies. And they used to say, and I used to say, why not? And they used to say, go into the emergency room on a Saturday night and tell me how many people you see as a result of drinking and driving. So
That's a great point.
there are lots
Yep.
of things that I think we could publish, and maybe we could combine some of these, donor acceptance policies and the gifts that we will accept, the gifts we will not accept on our website. That shows your donors some really important things about transparency, doesn't it? To do
I
that.
love that. And I was reading through the chat, Jack, and there was a few folks that referenced things like audited financials is a great way to
Yeah,
show transparency. Another thing that we do in the nonprofit industry that's really kind of unique to nonprofits is the 990. So the 990 is full of all kinds of information that shows transparency about your organization. And it also kind of shows the financial health and strength of your organization, but it
yeah,
also reports out on compensation of highest or
yes,
paid or key employees. So that's another way. Oftentimes, nonprofits will make sure that they have their 990s posted on their website and updated every year, so that your
yeah.
donors can see, all those types of things that are recorded in that 990.
Yeah, and you want to know something about the 990 that I want to share with you, Meredith, and the rest of the people? And it has to be our secret because I don't want anyone to know that I actually do this. But whenever I had a job offer, Meredith, I
Yes.
would always go to the 990 and see what the compensation
Yep.
was being paid for the position I was being offered. And
I have done it myself, Jack. It's a
oh
great
well,
way.
we're going to trust these people on this web not to say that, tell anybody in the future. But yeah, it works. Tell me
Yeah.
about, you've done that as well. Good. I don't feel like I'm the only sinner in this group.
Yep. Yep. I love it. I love it. Yep. We all do that. And that's great. That's why it's published, right?
That's right.
All right. Let's talk about the role of accountability. We talked about accountability earlier and what that means, but accountability refers to being open about successes and challenges, and it builds confidence in your organization's mission and leadership, right? So it gives your organization credibility. When you're open about your achievements and your challenges, your donors feel that they are receiving an honest picture. Um, it encourages long-term support. So accountability encourages long-term support. Donors appreciate authenticity. We said earlier that, being honest and transparent about not only your successes but also your challenges, sometimes can show your vulnerability, and it can help you to really establish a sense of urgency with your donors. So again, that authenticity is so valuable. Acknowledging your failures or obstacles that you're facing shows that your organization is constantly learning and improving. So that's a really valuable way to encourage long-term support from your donors. Let's see. Accountability also demonstrates transparency. So sharing both the good and the bad signals that your organization takes responsibility for its actions and for its outcomes. So by being accountable, nonprofits can prove that they're trustworthy stewards of donor contributions. So again, this transparency just sort of keeps this theme of transparency keeps popping up. Finally, I think I would say that the role of accountability creates opportunities for improvement. So being open about your failures invites input from your donors or from partners or stakeholders. It can shape strategies for future success. So again, I kind of use that old adage in fundraising: when we ask for advice, we get money. When we ask for money, we get advice. So, it shows that you're constantly learning and striving. It gives you opportunity to give your donors, for your donors to give input. So that's sort of the role of accountability here and why it's so important. That transitions us into our next really important topic here, and then we're going to have a community share on the next slide where we'll really get into a discussion on this. But let's talk a little bit about conflicts of interest. We asked in the beginning in one of our poll questions, how many of your organizations have conflict of interest policies in place? What do we mean by conflicts of interest, right? So a conflict of interest in fundraising occurs when a person's personal or financial interests can influence their ability to act in the best interest of the organization. So conflicts of interest arise in a number of different ways. They can be family relationships. So let me give you an example. A board member's spouse or child could be hired by an organization. Is that a conflict of interest? And when is it a conflict of interest? Financial interests. A board member's personal company sells products or services to the organization. So they are deriving some kind of personal or professional gain or benefit from their role on the board. That would be considered a conflict of interest. Competing interests. So a board member, let's say, serves on the boards of two very similar organizations that are competing for the same mission area, the same beneficiaries, or the same funding. That would be an example of like a competing interest. Donor relationships. A fundraiser maybe has a personal or a family relationship with a donor. So that could be perceived as a conflict of interest. There's also organizational conflicts. So that would be an example of that would be the organization itself is conflicted in a way that could risk its credibility. So the example that Jack, you gave earlier about funding coming from like the tobacco companies or alcohol distributors, that could be considered sort of a way in which the organization is conflicted, where it could risk its credibility as a hospital, or it could risk its credibility as a providing life-saving measures by accepting dollars or money from certain companies, right, or industries. So how do we address conflicts of interest now that we've kind of defined them? You can address conflict of interest by first and foremost identifying and assessing the conflict. Develop policies and procedures that address that conflict, and then create advisory councils or boards that can oversee those policies. Now, failure to address conflicts of interest can lead to a number of negative consequences that we really want to avoid. Things like internal and external dysfunction, right? So some of those examples we gave earlier, when perhaps maybe somebody is hired at the organization who is a family member of one of your board members, right? That could lead to internal and external dysfunction. There could be a perception of nepotism there, which would make for a very, dysfunctional staff. Other examples of how conflicts of interest can lead to negative consequences would be disruptions to operations and relationships with your stakeholders. So again, if they feel like you're not being transparent, or if they feel like perhaps we gave an example earlier of a board member who maybe perhaps serves on two different similar organizations with similar missions that are competing for the same dollars. What happens when that board member is, engaged in a funding conversation with a particular donor or with a grant making organization, and then they're going and asking for dollars, 2 weeks later on behalf of another organization for the same kind of mission area? That would be sort of a disruption to pose a threat of a relationship with a stakeholder. It could lead to compromised integrity, bad reputation. Worst of all would be a loss of public trust and even legal complications. So navigating conflicts of interest is a really critical topic in ethics. I think that my biggest takeaway on this slide here to share with everybody is that it's really important that you identify and assess your conflicts of interest, that you have policies and procedures in place ahead of time. It's really important that you are proactive in this area, not reactive.
Yeah. Courtney, take a look at the interesting comment that I'm sorry, Meredith, take a look at the interesting comment that Courtney has in chat, and I urge everyone to just take a minute to read what she's written there.
Okay, I'm looking in the chat. Courtney says, I have a somewhat unique example similar to the board example. Courtney says she works in fundraising for 2 organizations in the arts, vastly different budgets and program areas. She recently noted that one of the donors that she's worked with at one of the organizations is attending programming at the other organization. So she immediately disclosed this to the leader at the second organization and said that she would not be able to work with them, with that particular donor, since she was actively working with them in another capacity. That is, I applaud you, Courtney, for first of all, identifying and recognizing that you were maybe in a position where you had a conflict of interest, and having the, having the confidence to say something to your CEO or to your leader of the organization. I'm sort of curious in a follow-up, Courtney, if you can either take yourself off of mute or drop it into the chat box. How receptive was the leader of that organization to your comments when you raised this conflict of interest? Did you get pushback on it? Were you at all like admonished for it, or were they, thankful and grateful that you had identified this and kind of recused yourself from the process? Very grateful. He had 0 pushback. Very good. I
Nice.
love to
Yeah.
hear that.
This beautiful example that she's given us, and we should copy this and use it in future webinars, guys, as an example. It's not so much, do I think there is a conflict of interest there? Probably not. But you know what she's doing? She's avoiding the perception of a potential conflict of interest. And perception is reality, as we like to say in
Yep.
cause selling. So I really I applaud you too, Courtney, and thanks for sharing that. And I always say if I worked for somebody who did not push back, your supervisor did not push back, that's a good place to be working.
I love that. You're so right, Jack. Perception is reality. So avoiding any kind of perception of a conflict of interest is, good as gold, right? That's a good
Right.
policy to live by. All right, let's kind of jump into our next discussion topic here. Again, drop your comments in the chat box. Feel free to take yourselves off of mute. Here's the question we have for you. What ethical problems have you encountered in your fundraising career? Anything you can share with us that, like Courtney that was a great example that she just dropped into the chat box there. Curious if we have others where there's been a conflict.
Now, well, I always like to give this example, and I apologize to some people in the webinar who may have heard me talk about this in other forums, but I worked at a large healthcare facility, and I worked at several in California, but one of them, and they'll remain anonymous. I remember sometime in March, a donor came in with a large gift for the hospital, unrestricted gift. It was a beautiful gift, but he wanted to backdate his check to the prior year. And I thought and he wanted me to send a thank you letter acknowledging that I received the gift in the prior calendar year. And I could not do that because of a number of reasons. One, it would be a lie. And two, um, if he was audited or whatever, it would be a problem. What he did, which was interesting, is he went to the CEO of the hospital who he knew personally because he was a transformational donor to the institution. And she actually came to my office that same day and said, Jack, why not? Why can't you do it? And I remember saying to her, well, if he gets audited and they find that the check was cashed in March and that we put it on our records in March, we have the potential to have our 501c3 sanctioned or pulled. And once I said that to her, she said, okay, fine. and left. And as it turned out, he gave us the gift anyway, and it with the correct dates. So you know, it happens all the time. Pat has in chat a local politician. Let me read these chat questions to you, Meredith. Let's see. Pat, a local politician in executive position in healthcare foundation. He met with two local constituents and advised he would vote yes on something they wanted passed in council if they would support the foundation. Wow, that is
Yikes.
incredible. That's just incredible. I don't know how, you know, that's a tough thing. You know, I mean, you would hope that your board, your staff and your board would understand how, first of all, I think it has have to be a legal thing to do as well as an unethical thing. That's a tough thing. There are some tough situations we come into. We have a donor who seems to be moving into early Alzheimer's or dementia. She seems to have a compromised mental capacity, very forgetful, and yet the solicitor is still working closely with her to secure major gifts each year. It feels icky to me. Let me tell you, Courtney, it feels really icky to me as well. So we share the ick. But this is a hard one. When do you determine that you should stop soliciting? I think that when you have you're working with a donor and they have uh, the appearance, you know, you're not a physician, maybe you are. You can't say absolutely they have Alzheimer's or dementia, but if you see that there's some slippage in their mental capacity, you immediately have to change the way you are dealing with that donor. Maybe you have to have a family member present or somebody else who can be there when you are soliciting a gift or talk to someone else. You know, there's lots of things about, especially as you know, we work with an aging population, we have to consider. And some of this part of this question could be answered in a donor acceptance policies, a policy that your board establishes with dealing with people with diminished capacity. That sounds innocent, but then there are those who know better and still ask. Of course, Christy, you're absolutely right. There's lots of people who still ask. You know, I mean, I've seen lots of interesting things in my career. I see board members, you know, who have a romantic relationship with the director of development or someone else, or board members who say, you know, you do a lot of printing at this hospital. Wouldn't you like to use my printing company to print the things that you need to do in your hospital foundation? There's lots of things out there. So I think we have to be careful. And yeah, you know what? I'm glad sometimes you have to leave organizations that you cannot fix ethically. Because you know what? I think it's really important about your own reputation going forward. And if something like that, where, you know, people are, you know, selling things that they would do politically, I wouldn't want to work at an organization like that. Courtney, we have a similar situation with a donor. This is from Felicity. We have a similar situation with a donor at our organization. Would love to hear thoughts on this kind of situation. That's a great question. That's about the potential donor with early Alzheimer's or some form of dementia. Do they have family or others that you can work with? I love that, Heather. That's a really good advice. Definitely. Sounds like a CFRE question. And Mike, you are still in the zone, that CFRE zone. I love it. And unfortunately, I could that just ended. Will the recording and material be provided? I know Jess from the Fundraising Academy said by the end of this month, everything will be on the mylearningportal.org is the website, mylearningportal, one word.org. You'll be able to get this and see this webinar there. And Kristen, no more CFRE. I agree. Um,
Well,
and I love
these are some really good examples of, you know, ethical dilemmas or problems we've encountered as fundraisers. I can share with you a lot of my career has been with military and veterans organizations. So I work a lot with nonprofits that support military and veterans populations. One of the things we do in that space is we work closely with senior military leadership, right? We have something that defines not only the same way that we have ethics regulations and rules as fundraisers, the military and the government has their own list of ethical regulations that defines what government employees can and can't do. It makes for an interesting relationship because I will tell you, military and veteran, or I'm sorry, military, active duty military and government employees are prohibited from engaging in fundraising activities in their professional capacities. That is designed to not to eliminate any kind of perception that the military is endorsing a certain non-federal entity or endorsing any kind of nonprofit, or to this question we had earlier about political opinions or political the political landscape. So I've encountered these time and time again in my career. I will tell you with confidence that sometimes they can be a bit of a hassle to work around, but there has never once been an instance in which we haven't been able to be successful while still operating ethically on all of these different issues. So don't ever feel like, it will be like you have to skirt the rules. Don't ever feel like if you don't skirt the rules that you can't be successful in what you do, because you absolutely can. That sort of is a great transition into, we're going to leave the floor open for comments. This one's a little more geared towards questions, though. Is there anything that maybe anybody wrote down today as we were kind of going through this webinar? If you had any questions, anything you'd like us to revisit? Otherwise, we would welcome any of your comments here if you want to just continue the conversation. And then I'll hand it back over to Jack and just after we finish our questions, and he can share with you a little bit about how you can follow up on some of our content here at Fundraising Academy.
I love it when you're so crystal clear that there's just no questions. Everyone understood everything.
I hope so. I hope no
I
news is good
always get
news.
that. Meredith, that always happens to me. One never gets tired of hearing that you're so crystal clear. They just have no questions. Any questions or comments for that matter, right? I know that our good friend Jess has put in there in the chat how you could register, so you make sure you get that. Mike, what responsibility do we as ethical fundraisers have to call out unethical behavior? I have seen jobs advertised that are paying commission on fundraising. I think that we do have a responsibility to call out, especially in the organizations we are working in, unethical behavior. Something that we didn't, especially from our superiors. Here's something that I know I'm going to attend a webinar tomorrow or a workshop tomorrow on a new code of ethics for fundraisers that AFP is rolling out. So I'll share that with Jess from the Fundraising Academy. Once that's finalized, we will publish that on our website for you to take a look at if there are any changes. By the way, the Association of Prospect Research, I love their code of ethics. You should take a look at that, guys. Their code of ethics and the British AFP organization has a really good code of ethics as well. You could take a look at that. I think we have to call it out. The other thing that I maybe you did mention and I forgot, but if you have an ethical question, you could submit it to AFP Global. They do have a small team that looks at ethical questions and they'll give you some advice on how to deal with that. And I really think you should use that resource. And it is anonymous and, they're not going to share your name, etc. But I know in my own work, Meredith, probably you do too, I hear lots of different things um, from fundraisers around things that they experience at work or whatever.
Yeah.
Not like as Christine mentioned, from their supervisors, from the CEO, and definitely from the board. But one thing that you guys should all do is you should bring the code of ethics to a board meeting, pass them out, and talk about them. Get people to understand them. It's really important.
I love that, Jack. I love it that that was such a good resource that we can reach out to AFP with ethical concerns or questions, and that it's a great resource on how to get some guidance there.
Yeah.
These are some tough questions, and tough scenarios that we sometimes are we get confronted with as fundraisers, and so I love how there are resources available to us on how do we navigate this.
Hmm. And Meredith, some of it is some of these ethical standards that we have in fundraising, whether it's from AFP or the Association of Healthcare Philanthropy or the Association of Prospect Researchers, they're really just guidelines to help us get to that ethical point so that we're not violating any ethical guidelines. So it's not, some of these things are not clear cut. And if you look at some of the questions we received today, I don't have all clear cut answers on all of them. Some of them I do, but some of them are just, it's up to you and your own values. As Meredith used the word values early on, it's about your personal values and what you believe to be right and wrong and what your religion or your theology tells you as well.
Love that. All right, Jack, take us away on these that we
Yes.
got a couple QR codes we're sharing here.
Yeah, so Meredith and I are in a huge competition right now to see who gets the number of what is it, links on LinkedIn. So
Yeah.
there's Meredith's on the left, there's mine on the right, and definitely join our email list at the Fundraising Academy. I love the things that we do at the Fundraising Academy, whether it's monthly giving or cause selling or ethics or whatever. It's all valuable for you guys. So do join our email list.
One other exciting thing we want to share with you is we have a new Fundraising Essentials certificate course that is out. This is an incredible new opportunity that we have here. It's a 125-hour flexible modular certificate to help fundraisers meet professional development goals. They're available individually, or you can purchase them at in bulk at a reduced rate for teams. Maybe you work on like a large team and you want to train your whole board, or you want to train your team of staff members on fundraising. It's a really, really great opportunity. So check it out by
Yeah.
scanning the QR code here, and see if this is something that could be helpful for you.
Yeah, and I'll tell you, Meredith, you and I have both been working on this project and for almost maybe over a year now. But I think in my career, this fundraising essentials certificate is probably one of the most exciting and meaningful things I've done. I know we're working right now on our capstone project, which is the creation of a development plan. So, guys, pay attention to this. It's going to be nice. I'm going to be involved in it. Meredith is going to be involved in it. The other thing before we go, Jay sent a message in chat. Jay is a student at National University and would like to connect with either one of us. Definitely, I'm open to that. And Meredith, I know you have tons of things to do and 3 children. I like adding that because that's no small job. Yeah, definitely. You could reach me at jalotto, JALOTTO at nu.edu.
Same thing
Jalotto.
for, sorry, Jack, go ahead.
No,
Jalato at nu.edu. Same thing for myself. It's mterrian, TERRIAN at nu.edu. I did put up the previous slide. There was a request from Jay. He said, can you put up the previous slide? So hopefully you all get a chance to scan these QR codes. This one here is for that online, or I'm sorry, for the certificate course. And we have one more to share with you. This one here is for our online learning portal. So we have all kinds of free interactive resources on our online learning portal. Goes through that whole 8-step cause selling cycle that we briefed you on earlier in the day today. Take a look at all of the resources we have there. It's a great intro, tons of free information that you can get there. Anything I'm forgetting, Jack, before we let
No,
everybody kind of be on
no,
their way with their ethics?
I think it was a great, it was so much fun. I think this is the first webinar we've done together, and I expect that we will continue our partnership going
I
forward.
sure had fun. This was
Yeah.
this is one of those topics that's, not, I guess I would say it's not the most fun topic is, talking about ethical dilemmas, but we sure made it fun today. And I feel like, hopefully it was valuable for everybody that joined us here today.
Yeah. And if you're in Kansas City at AFP Leads, stop into my workshop on Friday at 8:45 or at AFP Icon in Seattle, where I will
Woohoo!
be presenting another seminar. Thank you guys for joining, and hello again to all of our CFRE participants who are here today. And love, peace, and stay well, guys.
Thanks, everybody.